In the marble corridors of imperial palaces, where power carved itself into stone and flesh alike, individual human stories often became footnotes to grander narratives of conquest and control. Yet within these structures lived real people, some wielding immense influence, others existing at the mercy of systems far beyond their comprehension or control. To understand any personal story within imperial contexts, we must first grasp the intricate web of relationships, dependencies, and hierarchies that define these worlds. Imperial courts were not merely centers of political power, they were complex ecosystems, where personal relationships intertwined with state affairs, where private loyalties could determine public policy, and where individual lives could be transformed overnight by the whims of those in authority. The institution of court attendants, young people brought into imperial households through various means, represented one of the most complex aspects of these power structures. Some arrived as gifts from client kingdoms, others as products of military campaigns, still others through family connections or economic arrangements. Regardless of their origins, these individuals found themselves navigating a world where personal agency existed within carefully circumscribed boundaries. Archaeological evidence from various imperial sites reveals the material conditions of court life: elaborate quarters for high-ranking attendants, educational facilities, libraries, and training grounds. These physical spaces tell us something crucial: that imperial households invested significantly in the development of those who served within them. This was not mere benevolence, but a recognition that effective court service required sophisticated skills, literacy, cultural knowledge, diplomatic acumen, and deep understanding of court protocols. The legal frameworks governing these relationships varied across different imperial systems, but common patterns emerge. Court attendants often occupied ambiguous positions, neither fully free nor enslaved in the traditional sense, neither family members nor simple employees. Their status could change dramatically based on imperial favor, political circumstances, or personal relationships. This instability created both opportunities and vulnerabilities that defined their daily existence. Contemporary sources, though often written by those in power, provide glimpses into these experiences. Letters, administrative records, and literary works reveal a world where personal relationships carried enormous political weight. A conversation over dinner might influence military strategy. A casual comment could elevate or destroy careers. Intimate friendships could reshape the fate of entire provinces. Understanding these dynamics requires us to look beyond simple categories of oppression and freedom. Many court attendants developed genuine relationships with imperial families, acquired significant education and cultural sophistication, and sometimes wielded considerable behind-the-scenes influence. Yet these opportunities came at tremendous personal cost. Separation from birth families, constant uncertainty about their status, and the ever-present reality that their well-being depended entirely on forces beyond their control. The economic dimensions of these relationships were equally complex. Imperial households required enormous resources to maintain their splendor and functionality. Court attendants represented both a cost and an investment. Their training and maintenance required significant expenditure, but their skills and loyalty could yield substantial returns in terms of administrative efficiency, diplomatic success, and cultural prestige. As we examine individual stories within these systems, we must resist both romanticization and oversimplification. These were human beings with hopes, fears, talents, and dreams, navigating circumstances that few of us can fully comprehend. Their experiences challenge us to think more deeply about power, agency, and resilience in contexts where individual choice operated within profound systemic constraints. The physical environment of imperial courts, their architecture, decoration, and spatial organization reinforced these complex relationships daily. Private quarters adjacent to imperial chambers spoke to intimacy and access, Elaborate ceremony and protocol emphasized hierarchy and deference. Educational facilities and libraries suggested investment in intellectual development. Secluded gardens and private spaces provided venues for the personal relationships that often shaped political decisions. This was the world into which young people entered when they became part of imperial households, a world of extraordinary privilege shadowed by fundamental vulnerability, of educational opportunity coupled with personal uncertainty, of potential influence balanced against complete dependence on imperial favor. Imagine arriving at an imperial court as a young person, perhaps no more than 12 or 13 years old. The journey itself, whether from a distant province, a client kingdom, or a family hoping to secure favor, would have been transformative. You leave behind everything familiar: language, customs, family, friends, the landscape of your childhood. What awaits you is magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. The first weeks would overwhelm your senses completely. Palace corridors stretching further than entire villages you might have known. Servants whose single garments cost more than your family earned in years. The constant presence of guards, their weapons and armor catching torchlight as they maintain vigilant watch. The smell of exotic incense, unfamiliar foods, expensive oils and perfumes creating an atmosphere unlike anything you've experienced. Your education begins immediately. Imperial courts required sophisticated attendants, individuals capable of navigating complex social protocols, understanding multiple languages, appreciating cultural nuances, and maintaining absolute discretion. Tutors arrive daily, scholars who teach you to read and write in the imperial language, philosophers who introduce you to court intellectual traditions, diplomats who explain the intricate web of relationships connecting your new world to kingdoms across the known world. The learning curve is steep and unforgiving. You must master not just formal education, but countless unwritten rules governing court behavior. How to approach different ranks of officials. When to speak and when to remain silent. How to interpret subtle gestures and expressions that convey meaning across vast social distances. The consequences of mistakes can be severe, not just for you, but potentially for others who might be held responsible for your conduct. Yet within this structured environment, genuine relationships develop. Fellow court attendants become your new family, sharing knowledge, offering support, creating bonds that help you navigate daily challenges. Some older attendants take protective interest in newcomers, understanding from personal experience the disorientation and fear that accompanies adjustment to court life. These mentoring relationships often proved crucial for survival and success. Your relationship with imperial family members evolves gradually. Initial interactions might be purely ceremonial, brief appearances during formal occasions where you learn to manage your nervousness and perform expected courtesies. Over time, as you demonstrate competence and reliability, you might be invited to participate in more intimate settings, private meals, informal conversations, recreational activities that reveal different aspects of imperial personalities. These developing relationships create both opportunities and complications. Imperial favor opens doors to advanced education, travel, cultural experiences that would have been unimaginable in your previous life. You might accompany diplomatic missions, witness important state ceremonies, gain access to libraries and scholarly discussions that expand your intellectual horizons dramatically. Your opinions might be sought on various matters. Your presence might be specifically requested for important occasions. But this closeness also creates vulnerability. Court politics are labyrinthine and dangerous. Rivalries between different imperial family members, competing interests among court officials, external political pressures, all of these forces swirl around you constantly. Your associations with particular individuals might suddenly become liabilities if political circumstances shift. Friendships that seem secure could become dangerous if former allies fall from favor. The emotional complexity of these relationships defies simple categorization. Genuine affection often develops between imperial family members and their attendants, affection complicated by vast power differences and systemic inequalities, but real nonetheless. These relationships might provide emotional support, intellectual stimulation, and personal growth opportunities, yet they exist within frameworks where your autonomy remains fundamentally limited. Daily life involves constant navigation of these complexities. Morning routines that might include private conversations with imperial family members about personal matters, afternoon activities that could range from administrative tasks to recreational pursuits, evening gatherings where political discussions mix with personal sharing, where your insights might influence important decisions, where your presence provides companionship that imperial family members might struggle to find elsewhere. Your identity transforms gradually but profoundly. The person you were before arriving at court becomes increasingly distant memory. New languages become more familiar than your native tongue. Court customs feel more natural than the traditions of your childhood. Your tastes, preferences, and worldview shift to accommodate your new environment. This adaptation represents both loss and gain, mourning for what you've left behind, excitement about who you're becoming. Physical comfort accompanies this transformation. Your quarters, while modest compared to imperial apartments, exceed anything you might have known previously. Quality food, fine clothing, access to baths and medical care. These material improvements create genuine appreciation while highlighting your dependence on imperial generosity for their continuation. The psychological impact of these experiences varies enormously among individuals. Some thrive in court environments, discovering talents and interests they never knew they possessed. Others struggle with homesickness, cultural displacement, and anxiety about their uncertain status. Most experience both positive and negative aspects simultaneously. Gratitude for opportunities mixed with grief for losses, excitement about new experiences shadowed by worry about the future. Your education continues throughout these years, extending far beyond formal instruction. You learn statecraft through observation, diplomacy through participation, cultural sophistication through immersion. These skills prepare you for potential roles in imperial administration, diplomatic service, or other positions of responsibility. Yet they also create dependence on imperial systems for their practical application. As you mature within this environment, questions about your future become increasingly pressing. Will you remain permanently attached to imperial household? Might you be granted independence at some point? Could you eventually establish your own family, pursue your own interests, determine your own path? These uncertainties create ongoing psychological tension, hope mixed with anxiety about circumstances beyond your control. The relationships that developed within imperial courts cannot be understood without examining the broader systemic forces that shaped them. These were not simply personal connections between individuals, but interactions fundamentally structured by vast inequalities of power, wealth, and social status. Understanding these dynamics requires us to look beyond individual experiences, to analyze the institutional mechanisms that created and sustained such relationships. Imperial power operated through multiple overlapping systems of control and dependency. Legal frameworks established the official status of court attendants, but these formal structures only partially capture the complexity of daily relationships. Economic systems created networks of obligation and reward that bound individuals to imperial households through material dependency. Cultural traditions legitimized these arrangements through elaborate ideologies of service, honor, and mutual obligation. The institution of court attendants served multiple functions within imperial systems. Practically, they provided essential administrative and personal services that enabled imperial households to function effectively. Politically, They created networks of loyalty and obligation that extended imperial influence throughout society. Culturally, they demonstrated imperial wealth and sophistication through the quality of education and refinement visible in those who served imperial families. These systems created what scholars term patrimonial relationships, bonds that combined elements of family connection, economic dependency, and political alliance in complex configurations. Court attendants occupied positions that were simultaneously intimate and subordinate, privileged and vulnerable. They might wield considerable behind-the-scenes influence while remaining entirely dependent on imperial favor for their well-being and status. The economic dimensions of these relationships reveal their systemic character most clearly. Imperial households represented enormous concentrations of wealth and resources. The cost of maintaining large numbers of court attendants, their housing, food, clothing, education, and healthcare required substantial financial commitment. This investment reflected strategic calculations about the political and administrative benefits that loyal, well-trained attendants could provide. Yet these economic relationships also created profound vulnerabilities. Court attendants' access to material comfort, educational opportunities, and social status depended entirely on continued imperial favor. Economic security could disappear overnight if political circumstances changed, if individual imperial family members fell from power, or if broader economic pressures forced reductions in household expenses. The psychological dimensions of these power relationships were equally complex. Imperial family members often developed genuine emotional attachments to their attendants, finding in these relationships sources of companionship, intellectual stimulation, and personal support that might be difficult to obtain elsewhere. The isolation that accompanied supreme power created authentic needs for human connection that court attendants could fulfill. However, these emotional bonds existed within frameworks of fundamental inequality that complicated their authenticity. How genuine can affection be when one party holds complete power over the other's fate? How meaningful is companionship when one participant cannot freely choose to end the relationship? These questions highlight the inherent tensions within such systems. The political dimensions of court attendant relationships extended far beyond individual households. These individuals often served as unofficial ambassadors, carrying messages between different political factions, providing intelligence about court dynamics, and facilitating negotiations that might determine the fate of entire regions. Their unique positions, intimate access combined with relatively low official status, made them valuable intermediaries in political processes. Gender dynamics added additional layers of complexity to these relationships. While both male and female attendants served in imperial courts, their experiences often differed significantly. Social expectations, legal restrictions, and cultural norms created different opportunities and constraints based on gender identity. These differences intersected with other forms of inequality to create diverse experiences within similar institutional frameworks. The international dimensions of these systems reveal their connection to broader imperial strategies. Court attendants often came from client kingdoms, conquered territories, or allied states. Their presence in imperial households served diplomatic functions, demonstrating imperial power while creating personal connections that could facilitate future political relationships. Some attendants eventually returned to their regions of origin with enhanced status and continued loyalty to imperial interests. Religious and ideological systems provided justification for these arrangements through elaborate theologies of service, concepts of natural hierarchy, and cultural narratives that presented such relationships as mutually beneficial. These ideological frameworks helped legitimize practices that might otherwise appear exploitative by embedding them within broader worldviews that emphasized duty, honor, and reciprocal obligation. The legal systems governing these relationships varied significantly across different imperial contexts, but common patterns emerge. Court attendants often occupied ambiguous legal categories, neither free citizens nor slaves in traditional senses, but something between these extremes. This ambiguity could provide certain protections, while also creating uncertainties about rights and obligations. Educational systems within imperial courts served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided practical training necessary for effective service, but they also created cultural transformation that bound attendants more closely to imperial values and interests. Advanced education became both a privilege and a form of control, opening opportunities while creating dependence on systems that provided such training. The physical architecture of imperial courts reinforced these power relationships through spatial organization. Private quarters adjacent to imperial chambers emphasized intimacy while maintaining clear hierarchical distinctions. Elaborate ceremonial spaces reinforced status differences through ritualized interactions. Educational facilities and libraries suggested investment in intellectual development while demonstrating imperial cultural sophistication. These systemic analyses help us understand individual experiences within their broader contexts. Personal relationships that might appear to be simple friendships or romantic attachments were actually embedded within complex networks of power, dependency, and obligation that shaped their development and meaning. Recognizing these systemic dimensions does not diminish the reality of human emotions and connections that developed within such frameworks, but it helps us understand how broader social forces influenced even the most intimate aspects of human experience. The long-term effects of life within imperial court systems extended far beyond the immediate experiences of those directly involved. These relationships created lasting impacts on individuals, families, and entire societies that reverberated across generations. Understanding these consequences requires us to examine both personal and systemic outcomes with empathy and analytical rigor. For individuals who spent formative years within imperial courts, the psychological and cultural effects proved profound and enduring. The intensive education, cultural immersion, and social sophistication acquired during court service created capabilities and perspectives that fundamentally altered life trajectories. Many former court attendants carried these skills into subsequent careers in administration, diplomacy, or scholarship, contributing to imperial governance and cultural development in significant ways. Yet these advantages came at substantial personal cost. The process of cultural transformation that enabled success within court environments often created lasting disconnection from birth communities and family traditions. Languages, customs, and worldviews absorbed during childhood might fade as imperial court cultures became dominant influences on identity formation. This cultural displacement could create lifelong struggles with questions of belonging and authenticity. The relationships formed during court service, both with imperial family members and fellow attendants, often remained emotionally significant throughout individuals' lives. These bonds, forged during vulnerable years and intensified by shared experiences of cultural transformation, could provide ongoing sources of support and connection. Alumni networks of former court attendants sometimes maintained informal communication and mutual assistance across decades. However, the fundamental power imbalances that characterize these relationships also created lasting psychological effects. The experience of complete dependency on others' favor, the constant need to navigate complex political dynamics, and the awareness that personal security could vanish without warning often produced enduring anxiety and hypervigilance. Some individuals struggled with decision-making autonomy after years of having major life choices determined by others. The question of family formation presented particular challenges for many former court attendants. Their unique backgrounds, sophisticated education combined with ambiguous social status could complicate marriage negotiations and social integration. Some found partners within court communities, marrying other former attendants who shared similar experiences. Others faced difficulties establishing relationships with individuals from different backgrounds who might not understand their complex histories. Economic outcomes varied dramatically depending on individual circumstances and imperial policies. Some former court attendants received grants of land, administrative positions, or other forms of imperial patronage that provided long-term security. Others found themselves without clear economic prospects after leaving court service, their specialized skills and cultural knowledge being valuable primarily within imperial contexts that they might no longer access. The impact on both families and home communities could be equally complex. Families who had sent children to imperial courts sometimes benefited from enhanced status and connections that such service provided. Former court attendants might return home with resources, knowledge, or political influence that benefited entire communities. They could serve as intermediaries between local and imperial interests, facilitating negotiations and providing valuable intelligence about court dynamics. Yet these benefits often came at the cost of fundamental family relationships. Years of separation during crucial developmental periods could create lasting emotional distance between former court attendants and their relatives. Cultural transformation might make reintegration into both communities difficult or impossible. Some individuals found themselves caught between worlds, too changed by court experience to feel comfortable in their original communities, yet never fully accepted as equals within imperial circles. The broader social consequences of these systems extended to entire societies. The practice of incorporating young people from throughout imperial territories into court service created networks of personal relationships that facilitated imperial governance and cultural integration. Former court attendants often became crucial intermediaries who helped imperial systems maintain control over diverse populations through personal connections and cultural understanding. These human networks contributed to imperial stability and longevity in ways that purely military or administrative mechanisms could not achieve. The personal loyalties, cultural knowledge, and emotional investments created through court service provided imperial systems with sophisticated tools for managing complex multicultural societies. Former attendants understood both imperial priorities and local concerns in ways that enabled more effective governance. However, these same systems also perpetuated inequalities and power imbalances that had lasting negative consequences. The normalization of relationships based on fundamental power disparities contributed to social acceptance of similar arrangements throughout society. The glamorization of court service could mask the personal costs involved while encouraging continuation of practices that prioritized imperial interests over individual autonomy. The cultural impact of these systems appeared in literature, art, and historical memory for centuries after their original contexts had vanished. Stories of court attendants became subjects of romantic literature that often obscured the complex realities of such relationships. These cultural representations sometimes perpetuated problematic ideas about power, consent, and human relationships that influenced social attitudes far beyond their original imperial contexts. For historians and contemporary observers, these experiences provide crucial insights into the human dimensions of imperial power systems. They reveal how grand political and military structures operated through intimate personal relationships, how individual human experiences were shaped by vast social forces, and how people found ways to create meaning and connection even within constraining circumstances. The resilience demonstrated by individuals who navigated these complex systems offers inspiration while also highlighting the human capacity for adaptation under difficult circumstances. Their stories remind us that even within oppressive structures, people found ways to exercise agency, form meaningful relationships, and contribute to their communities in valuable ways. Understanding these long-term consequences helps us appreciate both the remarkable human capacity for resilience and the lasting effects of systemic inequality. These stories challenge us to think more deeply about power, justice, and human dignity in our own contexts, while honoring the experiences of those who lived through circumstances we can only partially comprehend. The stories we have explored offer profound insights into the complex relationships between individual human experience and broader historical forces. They challenge us to think more deeply about power, agency, and resilience in contexts where personal choice operated within systemic constraints that few contemporary observers can fully comprehend. These narratives reveal the inadequacy of simple historical categories for understanding human experience. The individuals we have discussed cannot be easily classified as either oppressed or privileged, victims or beneficiaries. Their experiences encompassed elements of both opportunity and exploitation, cultural enrichment and personal loss, genuine affection and fundamental inequality. This complexity reflects the reality that historical experience often defies the neat categorizations that make analysis manageable but potentially misleading. The methodological challenges involved in reconstructing these stories highlight important questions about historical knowledge and interpretation. The sources available to us, primarily written by those in power, provide limited perspectives on experiences that were fundamentally shaped by power imbalances. Archaeological evidence offers material context, but cannot fully capture emotional and psychological dimensions of human experience. Literary sources provide cultural representations that may or may not reflect lived realities. These limitations require historians to approach such topics with appropriate humility while remaining committed to understanding human experience as completely as possible. We must acknowledge what we cannot know while making responsible use of available evidence to construct narratives that honor the complexity of historical experience without claiming certainty about aspects that remain necessarily speculative. The contemporary relevance of these historical dynamics becomes apparent when we consider ongoing questions about power, consent, and human relationships in our own societies. While the specific contexts have changed dramatically, questions about how vast power disparities affect the authenticity of human relationships remain relevant across historical periods. Understanding historical examples can contribute to contemporary discussions about ethics, justice, and human dignity. These stories also illuminate the importance of centering human experience in historical analysis. Political and military histories that focus exclusively on emperors, battles, and administrative structures miss crucial dimensions of how historical systems actually operated through intimate personal relationships. The individuals we have discussed were not merely footnotes to grander narratives, but active participants whose experiences were integral to imperial functioning. The resilience demonstrated by people navigating these complex systems offers inspiration, while also highlighting systemic problems that created such challenging circumstances in the first place. Celebrating human adaptability should not obscure criticism of systems that required such adaptation for survival. Both individual strength and systemic critique remain necessary for comprehensive historical understanding. Educational approaches to these topics must balance multiple considerations: historical accuracy, respect for human dignity, acknowledgement of complexity, and recognition of contemporary relevance. Simplistic narratives that either romanticize or demonize historical relationships fail to capture their actual complexity while potentially perpetuating problematic attitudes about power and consent. The ultimate value of studying these histories lies not in satisfying curiosity about exotic historical practices, but in developing more sophisticated understanding of human experience under challenging circumstances. These stories can contribute to contemporary discussions about justice, equality, and human dignity by providing historical perspective on persistent questions about power and human relationships. As we conclude this examination, we return to the fundamental humanity of the individuals whose experiences we have explored. They were people with hopes, fears, talents, and dreams, who found themselves navigating circumstances that few of us can fully imagine. Their stories deserve to be told with respect, nuance, and acknowledgement of their full humanity. Their experiences remind us that behind every grand historical narrative lie individual human lives shaped by forces beyond their control, yet still capable of finding meaning, creating relationships, and contributing to their communities in valuable ways. Understanding their stories enriches our appreciation for both human resilience and the ongoing importance of creating societies that better protect human dignity and autonomy for all individuals.